appreciate your support, particularly while we're closed to the public. Terech, from the who is the community engagement coordinator, I should say, at the Oshawa Museum here in Oshawa. Lisa has a Bachelor of Arts in History and Canadian Studies from Wilfrid Laurier University, and a Museum Management and Curatorship, I can't ever say that word, curatorship certificate from Sir Sanford Fleming. And just to throw it out there, in 2017, she was awarded the Ontario Museum Association's Award of Excellence in Promising Leadership. So thank you so much, Lisa, for joining this evening, and I will turn it over to you for this exciting talk this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex, and the Canadian Automotive Museum for having us this evening. I'm really excited to be joining you for this lecture series, and as this lovely intro slide says, tonight we're going to be talking about the 1937 General Motors strike. I am going to be turning off my video. I am part Sicilian, and that Sicilian likes to come out in hand gestures a lot while I talk. I've been told it's distracting, so I'm still here. I'm just going to be turning the video off so you don't see me enunciating with my hands. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that the Oshawa Museum is situated on the traditional territory and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations. Our work on these lands acknowledges the signatory communities of the Williams Treaties, as well as the Mississauga Nation and other members of the broader Indigenous community for their resilience and their long-standing contributions to the area now known as the Durham region. There we go. Okay. So a little bit about the Oshawa Museum in case you're not from Oshawa and or area. We first started in 1957, and for over 60 years, we've collected and shared the history of Oshawa, from the earliest Indigenous inhabitants to present day. Oshawa is located about 50 kilometers east of Toronto, and our museum is in Oshawa's Lakeview Park, so we're right on the shores of Lake Ontario. I like to brag that we have some of the best views in all of the city because when I do get to go into the office, I get to go down to the lake, and it's really quite lovely. The Oshawa Museum is comprised of 3 restored Victorian homes. These are the 3 homes that you can see up on the screen. We've got Robinson House down at the bottom, Henry House top left, and Guy House top right. All of these Victorian homes are still standing on their original foundations. Big fancy way to say that we didn't pick them up and move them to the park. I like to say that the park was built around our houses because they are standing where they were built over 150 years ago. Each house serves a slightly different function for us at the museum as well. We have a 4th building. It's our drive shed, and that's where we house our carriage collection and various agricultural artifacts. We are the only community museum in Oshawa, meaning that we look at telling the history of our community. The other amazing cultural organizations in our community have very specific mandates. Our mandate is Oshawa. We are home to over 50,000 objects and photographs covering social history, science, technology, and Indigenous history. Our collection is diverse, just like Oshawa's history, and we are committed to expanding the narratives that we share. The year is 1937. The city of Oshawa has a population of about 25,000 citizens. Alex C. Hall is the mayor, and an unforgettable strike in the history of Oshawa was about to unfold. At the city's large General Motors plant, 3,700 workers will walk off the job and will not return to the lines until a settlement is struck weeks later. Their requests were fairly simple: an 8-hour day, better wages and working conditions, a seniority system, and recognition of their union, the new United Automobile Workers, UAW. In late 1936, GM imposed 5 consecutive wage cuts while showing record profits. And of course, let's remember, in the 1930s, we are right in the middle of the Great Depression. On February 15th, 1937, the company posted new work schedules and increased production from 27 to 32 units per hour. Conditions on the assembly lines in GM before 1937 were characterized by line speed-ups, no rest periods, and fears that complaints would lead to permanent layoff. While the pay was good when people worked, wages were kept down to around $600 per year because of the seasonality of the work. Work lasted 6 or 7 months a year, the last 2 or 3 months of which were part-time with only 2 or 3 days a week. Many employees had to apply for municipal welfare. According to staff at Parkwood Estate is a large mansion museum in our community. It was home to Colonel R.S. McLaughlin. He was the president of General Motors Canada at the time. And so, according to staff at Parkwood, in 1936, GM workers were given gift baskets with a goose or turkey in lieu of a raise. The day after the baskets were handed out, the McLaughlins awoke to find a great number of the gifted birds tossed over the fence onto their property. While this gift seemed kind on the surface, the vast majority of workers did not own an oven and therefore had no way to cook this gift bird. They were young men in Oshawa, most of them in their late 20s, some married with a family of young children. Their minds and bodies were eager to accept the challenge of making a home and obtaining economic security. Then the Depression hit, and even more skilled workers were idle. George Burt, UAW Canadian director in 1951, said that, quote, "After several years of depression, we became bitter, disillusioned, and most of us were deeply in debt and on welfare," end quote. Employees conducted consistent economic warfare against General Motors in small ways. One worker said that, quote, "We were paid through a bonus efficiency plan, piecework, which was tailor-made for a company that desired to make the employees work progressively harder for less money," end quote. This is kind of a fun little anecdote. In late 1936, GM started to have some trouble. In the body shop, this is where the fun part comes in, the body shop employees would shut down the line and just sit down. Sporadic stoppages were taking place throughout the plant. Finally, employees walked out of the body shop and had a meeting. A committee was formed who represented the workers and met with management. This was the day that UAW Local 222 was born. When the 1937 model started, employees found their bonuses cut again and more work added with less men and women to do it. This is also where I'm going to add that this is a very visual presentation. There's going to be lots of photographs throughout. Unless otherwise noted, all of the images are from the Oshawa Museum's archival collection. So on this screen, I've given credit to the images where I know the credit can be due. The UAW sent Hugh Thompson, fresh from a successful organizing drive in Buffalo, to Oshawa to help coordinate the efforts here. Thompson arrived in Oshawa on February 19th, 1937, and he was accompanied by his wife and daughter, and immediately he attended a meeting of the body shop workers. Once the organizing began, it quickly spread from General Motors to the many feeder plants that were in our community. Skinner's, which was later known as Hudai, Phillips Glass, later known as Duplate or PPG, Coulter Manufacturing, and Ontario Steel Products. 4,000 workers were signed up with the union within a few weeks. Faced with ongoing labor disruptions as workers staged sit-down strikes in Flint, Michigan, that could perhaps inspire local workers. GM and the Ontario Liberals sought to sow divisions by stoking reactionary Canadian nationalism. GM justified its refusal to recognize the UAW by describing their leaders as foreign paid agitators, a description seconded by the Liberal Premier Mitch Hepburn, who rallied against the union as being foreign, dominated, and un-Canadian. Negotiations between the union and GM began on March 18th. The meeting lasted 15 minutes and failed to produce an agreement. The workers and management could not even agree on the basic issue of union recognition. Over the next 3 weeks, negotiations continued. A tentative deal, which would have seen GM recognize Local 222, was scuttled by Premier Hepburn on April 7th. On April 8th, 1937, one of the most important strikes in Canadian history began. And this image, as I'm crediting from the City of Toronto archives, it's from the Globe and Mail phone, and it's a group of union leadership strategizing at the union headquarters on the first day of the strike. So that photograph is dated April 8th, 1937, And we can see front row from left, Art Schultz, Local 222 Financial Secretary, Hans McIntyre, Steward Secretary, Patrick Murphy, the GM Shop Committee, William Harmer, Local 222 Recording Secretary, and Charles Millard, Local 222 President. In the back row, we can see from left, George Freese, GM Shop Committee, and George Day, GM Shop Committee Chairperson. On April 8, 1937, 3,700 General Motors workers punched in as usual and then walked off the job. They did not return to the lines until a settlement was struck 2 weeks later. The Toronto Star reported the strike as an orderly event. And I'm going to quote, "A stand-up strike, not a sit-down strike, with 260 women joining the men on the picket line. It begins quietly with workers first filing into work as usual at 7 a.m. and then 5 minutes later, just as peacefully, exiting the plant. Simultaneously, 400 pickets are flung up around the works with pre-arranged precision." And that was from the Toronto Star dated April 8th. The workers' demands were straightforward: an 8-hour workday, a 40-hour work week. They also wanted a steward and grievance committees, seniority rights, as well as that recognition of their union. According to a report in the April 11th, 1937 Oakland Tribune, R.S. McLaughlin, the president of General Motors of Canada, returned to Oshawa from his vacation home in Bermuda to take part in the negotiations. The difference in lifestyle between the company president and the workers was noted by a man named Homer Martin. He was president of the UAW of America at a rally at Martin's Hotel. No relation with the Martins. In the April 11th, 1937 Jackson Sun, which is from Jackson, Tennessee, Martin is quoted as saying the following: "As I came into Oshawa, I passed the luxurious home of Mr. McLaughlin, president of Canadian General Motors. I was interested to note the rather palatial grounds and the private airfield." Martin took this opportunity to contrast the lavish lifestyle of the McLaughlins compared to those who worked for the company, many of whom were struggling to make ends meet due to the precarious nature of their jobs. He did so to provide evidence that the union was needed in Canada to protect workers from corporations who place profits ahead of their employees. And this image shows pickets around a campfire at the Mary Street entrance of the plant. Recognition of the UAW was the primary cause of the strike. The UAW was an affiliate of the recently created Committee for Industrial Organization. It's abbreviated as CIO, and that later would become the Congress of Industrial Organization. The CIO was organizing industrial workers throughout the US and was looking to move north to Canada. The CIO was not just focused on auto workers, but all industrial workers. GM management, with vigorous support of the Premier, attempted to keep the CIO out of Ontario. Both the company and the Premier wanted a compliant labor force, one that was unorganized and cheap. As neither company officials or labor chiefs refused to budge, there was concern that the strike would degenerate into violence. Martin threatened to close up every General Motors plant in the US if the management remained remained obstinate. Despite the calm air surrounding the striking workers, the provincial police were mobilized in Toronto in anticipation of potential violence. At the same time, the liquor commissioner, Mr. E.G. Odette, chose to indefinitely close the liquor store, brewer's warehouse, and all beverage rooms in Oshawa to prevent any disorder. All of these concerns, however, proved to be unwarranted. In fact, only one Oshawa resident found himself in jail over the course of the strike, and that was a homeless man looking for a warm place to sleep. On April 12th, UAW President Martin came to Oshawa to speak at a rally in Memorial Park. And that is what this image is of, that rally in Oshawa's Memorial Park. A little bit more context if you're not from Oshawa, Memorial Park is located really in the heart of our downtown. Its name, as you might suggest, it was established after the First World War so that it could be a place for memorializing the fallen soldiers from World War I, and it opened in our community in 1924. After Premier Hepburn refused to admit Hugh Thompson into his office to negotiate on behalf of the striking workers, Thompson spoke at a rally in Memorial Park. Around 5,000 people, both striking workers and supporters, peacefully attended the rally to hear Thompson speak. Thompson warned that the General Motors workers of the United States would back their Canadian colleagues in their demands and hinted at a sympathy strike in the US plants. So this image is really, really, amazing. You can see everybody and just how packed this space was. I believe this is looking south towards John Street. And I believe this image from a private collection is of the same rally. What's really neat, though, is it's looking northwest. So we can see two Oshawa landmarks in this image. So at the building at the very left is the Center Street School, which later became the EA Level School. Today it's a continuing education center. And at the very right is the Masonic Hall. It opened in the late 1920s, so you're looking at a building that's less than a decade old, and it's still standing there as well. So both images are awesome because you can see the crowd and the people, but if you're interested in local landmarks, this one has got a couple of those, which might pique some interest. Premier Hepburn strongly opposed the CIO and used a variety of social, political, and legal methods against the strikers and union representatives. Upon learning about communication between dissenting workers and union representatives, Hepburn appealed to the federal government to deport the CIO representative, Hugh Thompson. When this was rejected, the Premier had his Attorney General, Mr. Arthur Roebuck, keep Thompson under secret investigation in the hopes of finding something that could be used to convince Ottawa to deport him. When this too was unsuccessful, Hepburn pressed the federal government for a contingent of the RCMP to be on the scene in Oshawa should the need to forcefully break the strike arise. The federal government refused to double the contingent of RCMP officers, so Hepburn used his political position to force the Ontario Provincial Police to recruit nearly 400 special constables as his own strike-breaking police force. They became known as the Sons of Mitches or Hepburn's Hussars. Faced with the possibility of intervention by mounted police, employees of the General Motors plant milled about the gates, which can be seen in this image, and established the picket lines. Premier Hepburn induced students from universities and other Canadian boys to join his police force. He continued efforts to thwart the CIO, threatening that there would be a march on Oshawa by his Gestapo-like agency. When Hepburn was challenged on this by the people of Oshawa, Mayor Alex Hall didn't allow the police force into the city. He felt it was not necessary given the peaceful nature of the strike thus far, and that Oshawa's police would be able to handle the situation. Alex Hall was in full support of the strike. Premier Hepburn once again called on the federal government to send in members of the RCMP to break up the strike. This time, the government agreed. Hugh Thompson received a phone call from Ottawa that the RCMP were coming to Oshawa to take over the town and, of course, help break up the strike. The people of Oshawa became indignant because the strike had been peaceful, and they protested loudly to their mayor to take action and not let the RCMP enter Oshawa. Mayor Hall stood firm against this move and refused to take legal action necessary that would have enabled the RCMP to enter the city. And this image, we can see the two gentlemen who are standing up. The gentleman on the right is Hugh Thompson, and Oshawa Mayor Alex Hall is on the left. And this was taken on Saturday, April 10th. Supported by fellow unionists, the workers held out for 2 weeks. Unfortunately, they received no financial support from the CIO as the group did not have any funds to spare. Hundreds of women also participated in the strike. In those days, most companies, including GM, had a policy of not hiring married women and of segregating women into separate departments. As with other companies, female employees were paid far less than men at General Motors. And unfortunately, in 2021, that is still a trend that we see today. But I digress. 500 women worked in the upholstery department at GM in Oshawa. One woman, Gertrude, to the bargaining committee during the strike. She was there to give voice to the women employees and to work to lessen the wage gap between male and female workers. This image, which was taken on April 15th, 1937, so exactly 84, if my math is correct, 80, more than 80 years ago, it shows women replacing male picketers parading in front of the GM plant, carrying Union Jacks and other Canadian ensigns. The flag waving was in response to the criticism from Premier Hepburn, saying that union organizers were foreigners. The use of the flags while picketing was also a response to Hepburn, who was accusing the striking workers of being communists. This was part of the efforts of Hepburn to keep the CIO out of Canada, and again going back to what I mentioned earlier, that this was appealing to Canadian nationalism and stating that those in the CIO were foreign agitators and did not understand what was best for Canadian workers. There was no violence, but each time a settlement seemed close, it broke down over Hepburn's insistence that there must be no involvement of American union organizers. The Premier's hard line divided his cabinet and resulted in him asking for the resignations of the Attorney General Arthur Roebuck and Labour Minister David Kroll, who were not in agreement with his actions. Kroll actually spoke out in support of the striking workers, stating that, quote, "I would rather walk with the workers than ride with General Motors." Eventually, General Motors was afraid of losing market to its competitors, and so they yielded. In the April 23rd agreement, GM accepted many of the union's demands without actually recognizing the union. When the auto workers returned to their jobs, they had won a reduction in hours, an increase in wages, seniority provisions, a grievance procedure, a rest period, and a clause which prohibited discrimination for past or future trade union activity. Yet, Hepburn was able to claim a victory because the UAW had not been formally recognized. The first agreement between the UAW and GM was ratified on April 23, 1937, when workers voted 2,205 to 36 to go back to work. The agreement gave employees a 5-minute rest period after the first 2 hours of work in the morning and afternoon. It instituted seniority and set up a grievance procedure. It also gave them a 44-hour work week, overtime pay and wage increases of 7 cents an hour for those workers who were earning less than 55 cents. And if you were earning 55 cents, it gave you a 5 cent an hour increase. The 1937 strike at General Motors in Oshawa is considered by many to be the birth of industrial unionism in Canada. After this, there was more pressure on the government to give legal protection to union members, but there was still no legal repercussions for employers who refused to cooperate. While the agreement accepted by GM employees did not include recognition of the union, it was clear to all involved that the UAW played a significant role in the outcome. The experience of Thompson and those who helped to organize the workers provided the knowledge to craft an agreement that an overwhelming number of workers supported. On April 24th, the day after the agreement between the workers and the company was signed, the Ottawa Journal made note of McLaughlin's reaction to the strike. From the article, I'm going to quote, "R.S. McLaughlin, president of General Motors of Canada, was a genial and smiling figure as he returned from a Bermuda holiday, glad his boys and girls decided to return to work. He said he was grievously disappointed when he learned of the strike. "They must have been promised the moon," he remarked. "We have always tried to be generous in our relations with our employees." The perspective of McLaughlin related to the working environment at GM was in vast contrast to the concerns noted by the employees. The workers held out for 15 days until the agreement was reached between GM and the UAW ended the labor action. It was a hard 15 days for workers who were already struggling financially. That first pay after the strike was much needed for those involved. The Oshawa Strike represented a critical juncture in Canadian history because of its resolution, which resulted in the creation of a more equitable labor conditions for industrial workers. The eventual concessions made by GM in regard to labor conditions were brought about in a large part made by the efforts of the UAW and the CIO. This success paved the way for unions in Canada. The strike was big news and was part of a growing labor movement across North America. Reporting on the strike appears in newspapers across Canada and throughout the US, which is quite lucky for us. There are some big gaps in Oshawa's newspapers. We are lucky that we have a few hard copy newspapers, and you've seen some of those headlines already in this presentation. But we don't have a lot of newspapers from this time period. The fact that we're able to look even so far afield as Oakland and Tennessee, it's really great for us because we've been able to add all of these newspaper accounts from this event. If we hadn't been able to look farther afield and if it hadn't been as reported far and wide, we would definitely be missing a little bit of the narrative and a little bit of this story. So yay newspapers, yay preservation. Immediately following the 1937 strike, the union had a greater presence in the community, even influencing municipal elections. However, union membership in Oshawa lost momentum. By 1939, membership fell from over 2,000 to less than 400. Still suffering from the aftermath of the Depression, workers could not spare money for union fees and remained fearful of management retaliation. Turmoil in politics within the CAW also contributed to the decline. While the membership of the union declined shortly after the strike, its impact on the community actually grew. The biggest development may have been the inception of the credit union, an organization that has played a very important part in the lives of many members over the years. The credit union was established, it was the Auto Workers Community Credit Union. They've gone through a rebrand within the last few years or so, they still are in our community. They still are quite generous and supportive. They go by the name Pathways Credit Union now. Shortly after the strike, the Ladies Auxiliary was established and worked together to make life brighter for Oshawa residents. It was World War II and the labor demands that it brought with it that saw the union strengthened. The union, now called the CAW, or Canadian Auto Workers, Local 222, was finally recognized in 1943, following a few walkouts in Oshawa. They were walkouts and not strikes because strikes were illegal during the war. War production became the priority at General Motors in 1942, and the workers at Local 222 alone produced over 30,000 armored vehicles. And I'll just read these quotes that are up on the screen from George Burt, the UAW director in 1943. "Winning the war is the first objective of our union." And Wesley Grant, reflecting back in 1951, "It was not until April of 1942 that the last automobile rolled off the line and the automotive industry turned over to complete war production, trucks, guns, and tanks." The war year also changed the future for women in the auto industry. Prior to the war, married women were not hired at General Motors. Women played an important role in the war effort, accounting for over half of the aircraft assembly department in Oshawa. Although their positions were seen as temporary, women proved as capable as men, and it paved the way for future women workers. By the end of the war, the union had full membership and was very well established. With the veterans' return, the union movement intensified, and in the late 1940s, industrial unionism consolidated. The impact of the strike can still be seen in small ways here in Oshawa. Philip Murray Drive is named for a Scottish-born American labor leader. He was the first president of the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, the first president of the United Steelworkers of America, and the longest-serving president of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Credit unions, as I mentioned, continue to be a valuable asset in the community, supporting not only their members, but also the community as a whole through their various sponsorships. And the 1937 strike here in Oshawa not only changed Oshawa, but Canada. It brought industrial unionism to Canada, which benefits families and communities from across the country. These images are of a display which we put up in the main branch of the Oshawa Public Library from a few years ago. And in late 2020, we were closed at the beginning of 2020 due to the pandemic. We were able to do a modified open in late 2020, and our feature exhibit was called Uniquely Oshawa. We wanted this exhibit to be a celebration of our community, and as the title implies, it was telling stories and sharing objects that were very unique and special to our community. We thought it would be a good opportunity to highlight the strike of 1937, and the artifacts that are on display are fairly recent acquisitions for us, and they were artifacts from the strike, including those two big soup tureens, which were filled with soup for the strikers during the strike. And with that, it brings an end to the formal presentation. I would like to thank you all so much for listening and joining us this evening. A quick plug of the museum before I turn it over to questions. You can find us all over social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. We are very active on these channels. Our mandate is sharing the history of our community. So if you're at all passionate about local history, give us a like and check us out. With that, I'm going to get my video started again and turn it over to our MC for the evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. So as mentioned before, if anyone has questions or comments, please use the Q&A tool, not the chat tool. If you use the chat, we can't keep track of you all. But if you've got questions or comments, please write them down now and we will ask them as they come. Do stay tuned for more on the Oshawa Worker at War coming to a Zoom chat near you.
Yeah, I didn't want to step on that too much. I knew that it was going to be a good topic of conversation next month.
So Lisa, right. I'll just start you off with, I'm just curious, what brought you to this topic when you started at the Oshawa Museum?
Well, we're always looking to tell stories of our community, and interestingly, this is one that isn't often highlighted in local history publications. So it's one of those lesser told stories. There's a lot of information about, speaking generally, Oshawa has been a very large industrial town for many, many years. We've got lots of information about the industrialists, not so much about the employees who worked for them. So that was really important for us, was to start sharing the stories of the people who worked and made this community and really became the fabric of the community, and this was their home. So that was one of the important one of the important reasons why we wanted to tell this story. But also too, it's not just a local story, it fits in with the national narrative. So it's definitely a story that we knew needed to be told. So we're glad that we're able to do it.
Great, and we've got some questions coming in. First off, what year did GM stop providing employee housing?
I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. I will make note of it and see if I can chat with my coworkers and see if we can find an answer to that.
We can actually speak, Alex and I, because we've been trying to figure out an answer to a similar question, which is when did they start providing employee housing? And we think around 1927 or so, but I don't know if that stuck through till 37, certainly. Up next, was there any direct influence from the sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan that happened, I believe, around the same time?
Well, it sounds like a lot of these unions were working together. You could see from a number of the people who came up to show support to Oshawa that they were ready to show similar legal action down in the States. So I think there definitely was a little bit of, it was a little bit symbiotic happening, but I can't speak more than that, unfortunately.
Now, you mentioned that pre-strike sort of work at the plant was seasonal. What was sort of keeping people from working there year-round?
It could just have been the nature of the production line at the time.
I can take that a bit if you want to, Mayor.
Please, yeah.
So typically back historically, we all think of nowadays it doesn't matter as much with the new model years coming out and so forth. But historically, it would take a lot more time to change over the line for the next season. So typically, the automotive season really started, I believe, really kind of August was the start. Anyway, it was about half the year. So I started talking without knowing all the details of that prepared, but there are definitely waves to that sort of the production. People then bought the cars. People generally, obviously in Canada, weren't going to buy cars over the winter, so they produced them for the spring season and then purchased them, and it all, goes back to just imagining how Canada was back in the 1920s, 1930s in terms of transportation, in terms of logistics of shipping those cars and manufacturing them. And so that was one of the reasons actually in our talk way back months ago in February, we talked about the GM factory back in Regina. And that was interesting because the farmers were idle during the winter. And so so the farmers, the people that actually worked at GM Regina would go back to farming actually during the spring and summer. And then during the winter, didn't have much to do. So it was an idle workforce that a company like GM would use seasonally. So I expect the same in Oshawa, where people would go back to farming as well. It wasn't a full-time year-round job yet.
All right, we've got another question. What was sort of local community support for the strike like among the sort of small number of people who weren't sort of direct employees or families of employees of the auto plant?
That would be something that if we had more local newspapers, we could probably glean a little bit more. From the size of the crowd in Memorial Park, that not only was employees, but that was community members as well. From the mayor itself, like Alex Hall was very supportive. So I would imagine it was very, very supportive. Even if you didn't work for GM proper, you likely were impacted by this company in some form or another, whether you worked for one of the feeder plants, whether you worked at a restaurant downtown and the employees came in and were supportive. I would imagine that there was quite a bit of community support.
So you'd mentioned that annual income was somewhere, pre-strike was around $600 for the workers. What did that sort of come out to post-strike? How much of a boost would that have been?
I don't have that information, unfortunately, and I wouldn't want to hazard something if I was wrong. Sorry.
Were there any long-term repercussions on the Hepburn government because of its reaction to the strike?
He certainly wasn't popular afterwards. What's also interesting is he left the premiership. I can't remember if he was exactly voted out or if he just bowed out. And his successor was Oshawa-born Gordon Conant. The Conant family is quite well known here in our community. And I have a feeling, if I'm remembering my Ontario history classes correctly, Gordon Conant's appointment to the leader of the Liberal Party, my apologies, not only was it because he was certainly an able politician and very suited for the job, but probably the fact that he was from Oshawa. Yes, it was a good 5 years later. Probably the fact that he was from Oshawa was not a coincidence as well.
Speaking of sort of local organizers, was there any backlash from GM against any of the organizers after the strike was over?
Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know enough to say for certain. Not that I've heard.
Okay. And going a little bit sort of further afield, do you have a sense of when, for instance, Chrysler, Ford, or International Harvester unionized by comparison to Oshawa?
No, unfortunately, I don't.
Alex, would you be able to speak to that at all? I don't know if we've covered.
I think it was around the same time the CAW was organizing. I think. I don't want to guess at this because I'll get it wrong. But I think it was fairly close in the 1940s. I think, as Lisa pointed out earlier, sort of when it was formed versus the official recognition. And I think the official recognition generally happened in the 40s, which again, noting that this is the time at Ford in Detroit, there was a lot of violence directed directly from Henry Ford onto workers. And so one of the great things we're very proud of in terms of automotive labor history is the lack of violence, generally speaking, in all of the plants during this time period, which is remarkable because the story in Michigan was very different for workers. So I think something that our local union and auto workers in general are very proud of for that history, that Canada in general and Oshawa has never had a violent strike. I think Lisa, you can probably speak to that. Work at the Oshawa Museum, we don't have those kind of exciting stories here in Oshawa, and that's a great thing that we don't have a violent history of unrest in our town. And I think that speaks to sort of the theme that runs through Oshawa's automotive history is sort of these back and forths that happen. Certainly there's labor agitation, but never sort of the violent hate that existed in other parts of the world and other sort of industrial sectors. Lisa, have anything to say about that?
No, just that I agree. You're right. We don't have that violent. We don't have instances of it, which is quite great. And I think too, when I mentioned earlier in the talk that all of the liquor stores were ordered closed, the bars were ordered closed, it was just a precaution. And I think, yeah, it probably didn't need to get done, but they just did it to say that, well, we're gonna, if there's any, just to remove any of that doubt. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Another question from south of the border. Do you have any sense of whether GM in the United States changed or altered any of its plans to expand or grow in Canada as a result of this sort of sudden wave of labor unrest?
I don't know enough to speak on that, unfortunately.
And then going more sort of Canada-wide, were there any sort of sympathy strikes or any other locations in Canada that went on strike parallel to this, or was Oshawa the only GM location in Canada that struck in 37?
As far as I know, Oshawa might have been the only one. Were they striking out in Regina, Alex? Do you know?
I don't know if this is a technical question. I'm not sure if the plant was open at that point. I think it reopened in 37.
Okay.
But it didn't come up during our February talk. So as far as I've heard, I don't think it would have been part of this action.
Yeah, certainly nothing in my research back in when we were first working on the exhibit indicated there were sympathy strikes. I don't think the UAW was organized enough to coordinate sympathy strikes at this point, or rather I don't think there was certainly attention in the States, but nothing like coordinated sympathy strikes anywhere that I know of.
And it also sounds like at this point they were looking to move north and come up to Canada and establish a presence here. Oshawa seemed like a good place. We were ready for that kind of union and support. So perhaps it just hadn't happened yet.
So we've got both a comment and a question that are sort of aligned here. I'm wondering if the settlement of the strike led to similar contracts soon after for other GM plants in Canada, like at St. Catharines and Windsor.
I don't know enough about their history to say, but definitely this was looked at as a landmark. It's always easier to come to these kind of agreements when someone else has already done it. So this might have been a start, but that's all I can say on it, unfortunately.
Keep them coming, folks. These are great. Was there any attempt by GM to sort of hire strike breakers or any kind of private security to crack down on the strikers, or did that sort of dovetail with the strike being fairly peaceful?
I don't think they necessarily would have, not with Premier Hepburn making all the noise that he was. Premier Hepburn was really not in favor of the strike. He set about creating his own police force to break it up. It certainly wasn't needed because the police or the strike itself was very peaceful. But yeah, I don't think they needed any kind of private outsourcing when you've got the Premier on your side.
So, a question about sort of what was going on. How active was the Union Hall that's on Simcoe Street North at this time? Or did it even exist as a Union Hall at that time?
I don't think it did. On Simcoe North?
It did. I'm going to jump in. It did.
Yeah, please, go for it.
That was founded, and again, I'm not in my office right now. It was just for a building. It's just north of the Four Corners there, I think on the west side. And we do have photos because the Ladies Auxiliary, actually. The great part about the UAW is that, or the CAW at the time, is they have the wonderful local 222 Ladies Auxiliary was formed as well. And we know that women's organization at that time took a lot more photos and kept a lot better records, I'd say, than men's organizations. And I say this working at historical societies and museums during my career, that I think, ladies organizations of this period had much better records. And so there are actually images of the first Union Hall, which was founded in 1937. And then there's been a couple of locations now throughout Oshawa.
I mean, when I think Union Hall in downtown, I think of the one on Bond Street. And then, of course, there's the one down in the South End, but I was not aware of one on Simcoe. So thank you for that.
Yeah, so the one I believe in the 50s, again, I'm guessing at dates here, the one that we sort of think of as that historic building, which is now going to be renovated into another use. Sort of dates from the 50s, but yeah, the original one, sort of the pre-war one, was there on Simcoe Street. And we actually do at the museum, part of what we received back in 2019 when it was rumored that the factory, that the assembly line was going to be shut forever in Oshawa, which it is not. It's going to be opening again soon enough here. But we actually are home at the museum to the Ladies Auxiliary Archives. So we now have that material, and we look forward to working with the Oshawa Museum and other organizations to share that specific story as well.
We've got a question about the photo with the women strikers waving Union Jacks. That was taken at the, do you have a sense of where that was taken? I'm pretty sure it's in one of the yards at the North Plant, but.
Yes, I believe it is likely around Mary Division, kind of that area. It was a press photograph, and up until a couple of years ago, we didn't have any photographs of this strike. So any of the images that were part of our collection, which were part of this presentation, were recently acquired in 2016, and they were all, I believe, press photographs.
Yeah.
But yeah, in and around Mary Street Division-ish, that area.
So I believe that's everything for now. As anybody's typing away industriously. Oh, I'll take this question and broaden it up a little bit. How involved do we have a sense of how involved the children of strikers were in strike activities, if at all?
That is a good question. I don't know. I am going to chat with my coworkers about that to find out. I mean, it's April. They likely would have been in school at that point, so that's definitely something. But I have seen, I mean, I'm sure if we look at some of these photographs, you're going to see kids in it. Yeah.
No, certainly in the strike of 55, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. There was
Yes.
the production of Christmas toys for strikers' kids, which was a big part of it.
That was a long strike. That was over the winter. It was, yeah,
Very different
definitely
experience.
very different.
Oh, we're definitely getting ahead of ourselves now.
Absolutely. Sorry.
Lisa, can you
And of
talk a
course-
little bit more about sort of Sam McLaughlin's relationship to the strike? Like, so when it started occurring, he was in Bermuda at his beautiful estate there that I've seen photos of. Do you have any idea of like how long it took him to get back to Oshawa, and was it sort of wrapped up by the time he got here, or sort of how did? Do you know what the sort of the timeline of or impact of his arrival in the city would have had on the strike?
That I can't speak on completely. I'm not quite sure exactly when he arrived back in. What we have gleaned about McLaughlin and his opinions on the strike is coming from these newspaper reports at the time. It is interesting that all of them do make note of the fact that he has returned from Bermuda, which 1930s Great Depression is ongoing. All of them have made note of that. To carefully interpret some of his words as well, it's interesting that he referred to them as his boys and girls. It's very trying to think of the right way to say it. It's talking down a little bit, for lack of a better way of saying it. So he didn't quite understand what they were so upset about, and the fact that they quote unquote must have been promised the moon. It just shows that little bit of disconnect between the president and the people who were keeping his factory going every day. There were vastly different experiences, vastly different understandings of the situation, and ultimately the strike resulted the way that it did, and we got to see the union go forward and protect employees, which is good.
If we've got time for more, I think we have time for more, but your call, Alex. Question about...
You have 4 more minutes.
Do you have a sense of...
then we'll cut it off. We'll try to wrap up at 8 o'clock here.
Okay. Do you have a sense of how sort of the schools would have dealt with this at the time? Like whether or not this would have been something that would be talking about with families or with kids in any kind of official capacity?
Unfortunately not. Lack of newspaper reports, lack of firsthand accounts, which would have given us some really good insight into that. And as I said very early at the onset, this is not a topic which has been widely written on in the past written Oshawa histories. I believe it might have been given like a page in a previous book. So we don't have a lot of that information. It just hasn't been recorded, unfortunately.
Well, how about we wrap up here? Unless you want to have one more question, Demeric? Do you have anything burning there?
Sure, yeah. How organized were the strikers on a sort of a group level? Like, were there sort of cells or units or subdivisions? And did that organization, do we have a sense of whether or not that applied sort of outside of work?
Outside of work, I can't say in the 1930s, but definitely when it came to the strike, my understanding is it was quite well organized. They already had that committee established, and the fact that the Toronto Star reported it, that everybody clocked in at 7 o'clock, and then 5 minutes later, everybody walked out. So everybody knew what was about to happen and what was going on. The signs were ready. They were striking. They knew what was happening. So my sense is, in regards to the strike, they were all fairly well organized and knew what was about to happen.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much, Lisa, again, for sharing your Thursday evening with us, talking about Union history in Oshawa, which you've definitely brought to life. And if you're interested in our further talks, we'll have our next ones coming up in both May and June. We will be sending out a survey here right after the Zoom talk, I believe, wraps up. There'll be a survey link sent out, so you can give us some feedback on how we can improve our presentations and ideas that you may have for other ones as well. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your evening. Stay safe out there, and we hope to see you at our next virtual program. So thanks, everyone, and good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks again.